We went through the Hall of Fame ballot the other day, and there's a couple of players who I think are already Hall of Famers who are currently playing, including one who made his imprint on the World Series this last October.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. You can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter or whatever it's called now, and on Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Blue Sky, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. So, yeah, we went through the fact that I like a very big Hall of Fame class, especially because we had some classes not too long ago. There was literally nobody voted in who was still alive. I believe baseball should be a celebration. Um, but it's interesting. I think that you take a look at some of the Hall of Fame stats, especially for hitters. I mean, I'm going to be focusing on hitters now. Later in the offseason, I'm going to be looking at pitchers. And I think there's some obvious ones, Clayton Kershaw, Max Scherzer. Did I mention Clayton Kershaw? It's the days of the Hall of Fame starting pitchers are getting kind of interesting. I do believe we need to get back to having pitchers go more than 5 innings. I think this whole idea of having them go through the order twice and then have a parade of relievers is not sustainable. We saw the World Series this year. Yes, the Dodgers won, but they having a parade of pitchers, and the Braves having a parade of pitchers a few years ago, and the idea of, well, they've thrown their 80 pitches. It's nothing to do with toughness. Athletes are stronger and tougher now than they've ever been. It's just the economics. It's nothing to do with sabermetrics. It's nothing to do with analytics. It has to do with economics. We don't have to pay pitchers as much if they're not pitching as much. And now we're seeing like, well, we'll just have them pitch 5 innings, then have a disastrous bullpen. Okay, we're going to talk about that some other time, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the hitting standards and some of the standards that are interesting to take a look at. The idea of 3,000 hits is so ubiquitous as a Hall of Fame metric that they actually made a freaking movie about it called Mr. 3000. The late, great Bernie Mac, who was one of the greatest stand-ups of all time, played Stan Ross, Milwaukee Brewer great, who finished his career with exactly 3,000 hits, retired, and through some analysis of his stats, he realized that some of his hits were later changed to being errors by scorekeepers. So he was several hits short, fell short of the Hall of Fame, and he went back to get his hits and later learned to become this, the other thing. But 3,000 hits was always you got 3,000, you're in, unless you did PEDs, which is why we're looking at you, A-Rod and Rafael Palmeiro. I've made it clear. I think they belong in the Hall of Fame. If you don't agree with me, that's why we got comment sections down there. But the idea of 3,000 hits now, I mean, who's got 3,000 hits who's currently playing? Freddie Freeman, maybe. He's currently sitting at 2,267 hits. And he's 733 hits shy. Now, the idea of him getting 200 hits a year, he would have to do that for 4 years, and people don't tend to get 200 hits anymore. Is he going to get 733 more hits? Well, maybe if he sticks around, but also he's had some injury issues. Now, granted, he plays first base, and it's not as arduous a position as some other are on the field, but it's still 733 hits is a lot. And the idea of him getting to that point is, I don't want to say impossible, but it's a long shot. Jose Altuve has 768 hits left. He's currently at 2,232. It's possible, but it looked like a bigger lock earlier in his career. It's amazing what happens when you start testing for PEDs and the ones that keep you healthy, how some of these players tend to fall off. But it's funny, they used to have every generation would have their 3,000 hit accomplishment over the years. I mean, I remember when I was younger, when the first year I followed baseball, 1979, was the first day I followed it day in and day out, and that was the year Carl Yastrzemski got his 3,000th hit and his 400th home run. It was also the year that Lou Brock got his 3,000th hit. And over the 80s, you saw Rod Carew, you saw who else got 3,000? I mean, you got Dave Winfield, Eddie Murray, George Brett, Robin Yount, Cal Ripken. There was seemed to be a, not to say there was a lot of them, but there was enough to keep you on your toes. A-Rod obviously got his 3,000 hits. Obviously, Derek Jeter got his 3,000 hits. Miguel Cabrera got his 3,000 hit. Albert Pujols got his, so there was always this titan who was in dominating that generation who would make the 3,000 hit mark. You know, but who's this generation's going to be? I mean, is it going to be Altuve? Is it going to be Freeman? They're the ones who are the closest. I mean, Andrew McCutchen and Paul Goldschmidt are over 2,000 hits, but there's no chance. McCutchen's probably going to retire, and Goldschmidt is limping to there. But it's interesting that at least for me, that you don't have that great generational player who's going to hit all the marks. In some ways, as I said before, Freddie Freeman is about as close as you could get on that. I think you take like total bases. If you get 4,000 total bases in the history of baseball, only 90 players, which is not a lot when you consider it, only 90 players have reached 4,000 total bases. In terms of 5,000, only 22 players in the history of baseball have ever compiled 5,000 total bases. Now, Freddie Freeman is currently at 3,866. He needs 134 more. He's a cinch to get that. When you include the singles, the doubles, the triples, and the homers he's going to hit, he will be he will make it 91 players in the history of baseball to reach total bases, to accumulate 4,000 total bases. And maybe playing about 5 more years or so, 5,000 might be in that ballpark. And Freddie Freeman, I think Freddie Freeman, if he gets to 4,000, I think any discussion of his Hall of Fame career, we need to say, yeah, he's in the Hall. I think he's in the Hall right now anyway. Now, times on base. I think times on base is one of the most fascinating stats in baseball because you would think that would be as as well known a stat as say hits. That's where what you're supposed to do as a major leaguer, right? Getting on base. The times on base should be a metric of greatness. And when you consider how many times we have players who are now there's more of a premium on getting walks and getting on base, not just by hits. The times on base should be a great metric in terms of who's the great players of the time. Now, I will say right now, Freddie Freeman is knocking on the door of Hall of Fame company. 4,000 times on base. Only 48 players in the history of baseball have done that. Now, Freddie Freeman has to get on base 616 times more in his career. He's not going to do it this year, but if he plays for 4 more years, he'll probably get to that point and be in the top 50 or the top 49 all time. Jose Altuve needs 1,092 more. It'll take a while for him, and he has to avoid any major injury. But when you take a look at the career times on base, the people who have, I mean, as I said, Freddie Freeman is knocking on the door of 4,000, which would put him, currently number 48 is Manny Ramirez at 412. But the magic number for times on base of reaching that pantheon, 7 players in the history of baseball have reached the 5,000 mark. They are Pete Rose, Barry Bonds, Ty Cobb, Ricky Henderson, Carl Yastrzemski, Stan Musial, and Henry Aaron. Babe Ruth missed it by 22 times, which is unbelievable when you think about it. But that top 7, this is getting on base by a hit, a walk, or a hit by pitch. And any one of those, the 7 that Babe Ruth fell short, Willie Mays fell just short, Ted Williams fell just short. Of course, he had the war. But you had the 7 are Rose, Bonds, Cobb, Henderson, Yastrzemski, Musial, and Aaron. If you join that group, then you're in the absolute pantheon. The idea of Freddie Freeman getting to that point, he would have to get on base roughly 1,200 more times in his career. That's a lot. But I'm sorry, yeah, about 1,500 times more in his career. That's a lot. By the way, Freddie Freeman is also really close to another Hall of Fame category, which is maybe not as sexy as it used to be, but it's still worth noting. 2,000 runs batted in, 2,000 RBI. Now, only 5 players in the history of baseball have reached 2,000 RBI, but 1,500 is within reach of Freddie Freeman. And only 56 players in the history of baseball have reached that level. And he's only 268 runs batted in away from that. I know we're not supposed to look at RBI anymore, but that's still a pretty impressive list. What I'm saying is, I think Freddie Freeman, without us noticing, has been that player of this generation, that great all-around offensive player. I know he's a fine player. I know that he's an MVP. I know that he's a silver slugger, but he's kind of snuck up on us in a weird way. He had great years. We always looked at him as a star and as a potential Hall of Famer. But are we really looking at what he is? Is he the best all-around offensive player of this current generation? Okay, maybe Mike Trout is probably the right answer for that. But Freeman's peak is lasting longer than Trout's. Trout's peak is basically between 2012 and 2019. And then the injuries have started to kick in after that. Well, Freddie Freeman has been chugging, and mentioned chugging along. Have we been sleeping on how great Freddie Freeman is? Let me rephrase that. Have I been sleeping on that? Well, I'll tell you one thing I find interesting is that the current era of players are showing how hard it is to reach one specific kind of milestone in baseball. And quite frankly, it's showing us in retrospect how great the kings of that category really were. All right, it's time to hear from our friends over at FanDuel. Now, the NFL, the season's going to be winding down pretty soon, and the playoffs will be starting pretty soon, which means your pal Sully will start paying attention. You better get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So if you got a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. You know, when the home run records started falling left and right, the thought process was the steroid era and certain other elements in baseball have made the home run records a sham and this, that, and the other thing. And when you look at how many of the players, if you go to baseballreference.com, the single greatest website in the history of the planet Earth, and you have the top 20, basically the top 25 home run hitters in the career home run leaders. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 of them had their peak between after the strike, which is pretty much where a lot of people start to point as the beginning of the steroid era, is after the strike. So 11 out of the top 24, all after 1994. From 1901 to 1994, you have 13. Between 94 and present, you have basically the other half. And so you have the likes of Bonds, Pujols, Rodriguez, Griffey, Tomey, Sosa, McGuire, Palmeiro, Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, Frank Thomas, all in there, alongside of Aaron, Ruth, Mays, Frank Robinson, Harmon Killebrew, Reggie Jackson, Mike Schmidt, Mantle, Fox, McCovey, Williams, Banks, and Eddie Matthews. Well, nobody's really knocking on the door right now. And if we're seeing the end of the PED era, or at least the PED era as it existed, the idea of reaching the 500 home run mark is a real long shot. The current leader, you got Giancarlo Stanton, has 439 home runs. Do we really think he's going to hit 16 more home runs? He might. He might. But we also know he has tons of injury issues. And he could very well have a season where he hits 15 or 16. He could stay healthy for most of the season and get 45 home runs and get almost all the way there. But it makes you look at those players who hit 500, 600 home runs, even in the PED era, and make you go, wow, because Stanton's the only one with a legit shot of cracking any number of home runs to be in the all-time leaders. Mike Trout at one point looked like he was a cinch to be there, but he's sitting at 378 home runs, and let's face it, is a huge injury issue right now. Paul Goldschmidt is clearly in the back nine of his career. He's sitting at 362. Freddie Freeman is going to have great career numbers, and he'll probably get to 400 as he's at 343 right now, but 500? No way. Manny Machado, who's sitting at 342. Nolan Arenado sitting at 341. Bryce Harper sitting at 336. All of them have a chance to get to 400 home runs if they stay healthy. But 500 is completely out of reach, even for Aaron Judge, who, by the way, is not nearly as young as you think he is. He's in his 30s, has had injury issues, and he's sitting at 315. Again, all terrific careers. But one of the advantages we're seeing of this new day and age of testing and everything like that is the players who are at the top of the home run leader are going to be there for a while. One thing that I realized that the top home run hitters of all time, by the time they settled in the mid 70s, of Aaron, of Aaron, Ruth, Mays, Robinson, Killebrew, Mantle, McCovey, Williams, Matthews, Ott, Gehrig. That group sat at the top of the all-time home run list from about the mid-70s until Schmidt and Jackson nudged their way into that. But the top group, Aaron, Ruth, Mays, Robinson, and Killebrew were the top for about a generation and a half. They were kind of like the indisputed, like absolute apex of the great home run hitters, which is one of the reasons why some people got so upset when Bonds, A-Rod, and yeah, I'll throw Pujols' name in there too, became the great interlopers. I've always had suspicions of Pujols. And now, mind you, I, Bonds hit the most home runs. He is the top. Pujols has joined the 700 club, not Pat Robertson, the 700 home run club. You know, Rodriguez is 4 shy, and I've always found that bizarre that he's 4 shy, that the Yankees couldn't wait to get rid of him. Griffey got 630 despite all of his injuries. So I think that this group that we have right now is safe for the next 15 years. I mean, I don't think anybody currently playing has a chance to crack. I mean, let's just take McGuire. McGuire's at 583. No one's gonna hit 500. I mean, Eddie Murray is currently at number 28 with 504 home runs. The only player with an outside chance is Giancarlo Stanton. The idea of cracking the top 20, which is right now 521 home runs, which is tied. You have a three-way tie between McCovey, Thomas, and Ted Williams. No one's cracking the top 20. No one's going to crack the top 20 of home runs for a generation, for at least a generation. So get used to this crew on the top. Get used to them, whether you liked them or not, which makes me think by the time someone starts moving up the ladder in 10 or 15 years, the veteran committee will start bringing in the Sosas, the McGuires, the A-Rods, and the Barry Bondses to the Hall of Fame, where, quite frankly, I think they belong. Speaking of a Hall of Famer, on this date in baseball history, one of the great players in baseball history almost changed the trajectory of the major leagues. And notice how I said that, the major leagues. Today in baseball history in 1914, Walter Johnson, who statistically is one of the greatest pitchers in the history of baseball. He was playing for the Washington Senators, Nationals. Their name went back and forth. And he was the best pitcher in the game. He was one of the great drawing cards in baseball. And in 1914, he was at his peak. At the time, a third major league was trying to edge its way into baseball. Now, remember, the National League was formed in the in the 19th century. There were several teams that were part of the American Association, National Association. Eventually, they got together and became the National League, and they were playing in the 1880s and all this other stuff. In the 1900s, the Western League changed their name to the American League, moved several of their teams into major league cities, and took them on. And at first it was contentious, and then they worked out an agreement with this little thing called the World Series. Well, just 10 years after the first World Series, a third league was introduced, and it was called the Federal League. By the way, this book here is called The Outlaw League. Some of you have asked me to give you recommendations for baseball reading. I absolutely recommend this one. It is called The Outlaw League and the Battle That Forged Modern Baseball. It's by Daniel Levitt, and it is the definitive book about the history of the Federal League, the third major league. And they put themselves into cities that had major league teams already, like Brooklyn, like Chicago, like Pittsburgh. And they also aimed for some cities that didn't have a major league team, like Buffalo, like Baltimore, the Baltimore Orioles, like Kansas City. And and I believe they had Louisville at one point. And they decided that they were going to try to do what the American League did not that long before. Now we could have 3 major leagues and compete hard for them. And you saw that there was the league that was formed by John T. Powers and had a lot of rich, powerful people, including Charles Wegman, who decided he was going to build the biggest and most impressive stadium in Chicago that already had the White Sox and already had the Chicago Cubs. Now, one of the things that this new Federal League wanted to do is they wanted to attract stars to their league to give them a sense of legitimacy because they knew they had an uphill battle. But if they had some stars on their team and put together a good product, they'd be able to take them on the way the American League took on the National League. And they offered bigger contracts. Now, remember, there was no free agency back then. Back then, teams in the American League and National League had what was called the reserve clause. At the end of the year, if you couldn't come up with a contract agreement, the team had the right to just renew your previous contract. You couldn't go to free agency. Now, that was defeated in courts in the 1970s, but in the 1910s, it was completely the way they did business. Well, the new Federal League said, hey, we will offer you big contracts. The American League and National League said, if you sign with the Federal League, you're blackballed from us. And they needed a marquee star. Joe Tinker, future Hall of Famer, made the leap. But in 1914, the Chicago Whales, owned by Wegman, made a contract offer to Walter Johnson. This would have been like bringing in Clayton Kershaw in his prime to a new major league. This was I decided to sort of make it easy for us to swallow right now. And this would have been a seismic moment because it would have given some amount of legitimacy to the Federal League. He would have made more money, and Washington wasn't going anywhere. Mind you, this was a chance for him to make some bucks and be the flagship star of the new league. Well, the American League and National League wet their proverbial pants. Clark Griffith, who owned the Senators, was threatened to take the new league to court, saying, you're violating our contract. Of course, if he took them to court, chances are they would have had the reserve clause in big trouble at that moment, because why couldn't Walter Johnson take a better offer? Anyone else in the world could take a better job offer. And I guess the threat was if Walter Johnson left, he would be blackballed, which I have a hard time believing. And then Walter Johnson would never find a home back in the American League. Again, not buying it. However, the owner of the Senators, Griffith, went to visit Walter Johnson at his home years later, months after the contract was offered to him. And this was the day that Walter Johnson accepted the contract to join the Chicago Federal League team, which was nicknamed the Whales. I don't know why it was called the Whales. 2 weeks later, Griffith agreed with Walter Johnson to sign. Basically, he matched the contract with Chicago, and he returned to the Senators. In a couple of years, the Federal League folded. And with that, the Federal League sued the pants off of Major League Baseball, or at the time it was called organized baseball, saying, you're running a monopoly. We can't do our business, and you're acting like a monopoly. This is illegal. And several judges took a look at it and said, well, technically, but baseball isn't commerce. Baseball is not a money-making industry. It's fun and games, so they can operate any way they want. And with that, baseball had its famous antitrust exemption, which they hold to this day. Other sports don't, but baseball has an antitrust exemption, which they cling to like a koala. And anytime it's threatened to this day in the courts, they wind up coming up with compromises and coming up with renegotiations, including the formation of several expansion teams. But the Federal League folded. The Federal League gave us the Major League Baseball antitrust exemption. It also gave us Wegmans Ballpark that he built in Chicago, that when the Chicago Whales folded, the Cubs moved into Wegman Park, abandoning their old park. and moving into Wegman Park, which they renamed Wrigley Field when it stands to this day. But what would have happened? Would we have had a third major league? Would that federal league exist in cities that wanted to have a major league franchise and didn't? Would they have moved some teams around to, to accommodate several cities that didn't have a big league squad, but still keep the talents in places like Chicago and in Brooklyn? Would a third league have led to a fourth league, which probably would have been the Pacific Coast League, as teams in California were pretty dang good and probably could have played at the level of the major leagues? I don't know, and neither do you. But on this day, way, way back in 1914, one of the big marquee stars in baseball almost gave a third major league the star they were looking for. Well, hopefully I'm the star that you're looking for in baseball podcasting. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter or on Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Tomorrow's show, we're going to be talking a lot about things that happened on this day on December 5th, which was a very interesting day in baseball history. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan of Locked On MLB. Please call me Sully.